Welcome to the program. In light of the recently proposed new budget from the Trump White House, I wanted to have author and activist David Swanson back on the program. David is the perfect person to respond to a proposal that defunds so much of what we do in this country and moves it all into the war machine. David is the director of worldbeyondwar.org and the author of War is a Lie and Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency. David, welcome back.
Thanks, Coy.
Thanks for coming. So, your reaction. Help us understand what we should know. And from your perspective, what does it mean when we have a president in the early 21st century who says, I don't want our country to invest in art. I don't want our country to invest in education. We need to put it all into bombs and tanks and fighter jets because it's a dangerous world out there.
Yeah, well, 50 years ago, April 4th, Dr. King spoke against a war at Riverside Church and said if we invest more in the military than in programs of social uplift, we're approaching spiritual death. Well, we passed spiritual death some decades back. We're the living dead. But this, I appreciate your accurate description of Trump's budget proposal, because most of what you hear out there in terms of opposition to Trump's budget proposal from Democrats and Democratic partisan activist groups is, don't cut this, don't cut that, don't cut that, as if Trump is shrinking the budget, so that you have advocates from the other side, misinformed, getting the wrong impression, coming out and saying, no, I love cuts, I want small government, we need the small government. Not what's happening, not relevant at all. Trump has proposed the exact same size budget as the previous year, but as you accurately said, is proposing to move $54 billion from everything else. I mean, cutting numerous departments and agencies by 2030, 100%.
Or eliminating them entirely.
100% gone.
The National Endowment for the Humanities, gone.
Right.
Yeah.
Eliminated. Moving all of that, not into tax cuts, but into the military. This is the fiscal responsibility, right? You move all the money into the one program that's never audited, the Department of so-called Defense. With a $33 billion supplemental bill coming in April from the Trump White House for the previous year's budget. So you can expect a similar or larger one, maybe multiple supplemental bills. So you're looking at over 60, possibly over 65% of federal discretionary spending, of the money that Congress decides what to do with every year, going to one thing, right? We haven't seen this since Reagan was in the White House. And this is why the small, big government thing makes no sense, right? I want a drastically smaller government, and I want massive increases in spending on just about everything. All these little programs that, get denounced as wasteful spending, they're nothing compared to the military.
It's an important point to point out, because when people see, oh, Trump is cutting this, Trump wants to cut that, he wants to eliminate this department and that department, he's not freeing up money to give it back to citizens.
No.
He wants to take that money here and give it to the Pentagon.
It's a dangerous falsehood to be calling these things cuts, because it's not cuts. It's moving the money from one thing to something else and keeping the budget the same size.
And there's no proposal for how they intend to pay for this yet. That's something they're going to have to grapple with.
Well, it's the same size budget,
right.
And so if they start cutting taxes on billionaires, they won't have the money to pay for it.
So we're not talking about smaller government with this president in the least.
No.
We're talking about a much bigger Pentagon, a much bigger war machine.
Paralleling Ronald Reagan, who was not creating a smaller government, but was moving money from everything else to the military. And this is the number one way in which war kills, is moving money out of other programs into the military. It's not with bombs, missiles, drones, tanks, depleted uranium, napalm. The number one way in which militarism kills is taking money away from other things. You're looking at over $700 billion from the United States in this one little program, the military, year after year after year, another $700 billion.
And what do you mean that's how people...
Well, according to the United Nations, with $30 billion a year, you could end starvation on Earth. With tens of billions of dollars, you could provide clean drinking water everywhere on earth that lacks it. You could end this disease, end that disease, end hunger, provide housing, provide sustainable energy. I mean, these are things that sound like huge, massive programs, and they are, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to just the increases in recent years in U.S. military spending.
Yeah, and he also wants to take money away from scientific research. Speaking of disease, wants to pull all of that money out of science, and research, and education, and put it in investing in war.
Right. So you have a scientists' march on Washington. This is a new thing about the climate and accuracy and facts, but also about the budget. 18% being cut from scientific research.
What does history tell us? Can history be any guide for us, David, about when cultures and societies de-invest in their own culture, in their own well-being as a society, and totally focus on killing others?
Empires do this, and empires collapse after they do this, and that's what we're looking at. And it's a question of how painful and how swift or how slow, and what form the collapse is going to take, and whether through environmental destruction or nuclear war or other means it's going to kill us all in the process.
And history isn't shy about that lesson in the least. It happens over and over and over and over again.
No, these are horribly dangerous trends because all the money is going into militarism, into unaccountable use of force, and a little bit into military-like departments in order to build walls and arrest and deport immigrants. Nothing into sustaining our culture, our health, our prosperity, our way of life, our sustainable agriculture and
we can connect
energy.
the dots. You can absolutely connect the dots between the increased militarism of the federal government and spending public money on a war machine and the militarism of local law enforcement, because that technology, even the very uniforms, are then handed off to local police, creating the very thing that the founders of this country, for all their faults, as you like to say, they got some things right. And one of the things they got most right was beware of a standing army. Beware of soldiers standing around on street corners in your neighborhood, because that's the end. That's doom. And that's what we're doing when we make our culture more militaristic. We see now in local law enforcement the very standing army the founders feared most.
There was not to be a federal standing army. There was not to be a permanent war machine. There was to be the funding of defensive wars for no longer than a 2-year period at a time, declared by the exclusive war power of the Congress.
Not the president.
Now it's a permanent war machine. It's not just 50 years this week since Dr. King's speech against war, but it's 100 years since the Senate voted the same day, about 50 years earlier, to enter the Great War, the war to end all wars. And we've had a permanent war machine ever since, dramatically increased at the time of the Second World War. And they've been trying to end war with war for 100 years with no success whatsoever to show for it. And you have not just $700 billion from the United States going into militarism, but the rest of the world put together investing just about as much. The United States is spending just about as much as everybody else put together. There's only 20 countries that reach $10 billion a year in military spending. 9 of those are NATO members, 8 of them are U.S. allies, and the 3 that aren't could be U.S. allies with a different approach. And the one of those 3 that's demonized the most now, Russia, has dropped its military spending in recent years from $70 billion to $48 billion a year. I mean, this is their evil plot to dominate the world, $48 billion a year, while the United States is going up close to $1 trillion a year in military spending. It's not defensive, despite the name of the department.
Yeah. So take a moment, David, and respond to those who are watching us right now, and specifically those who are thinking, listen to this liberal claptrap moaning. Don't these guys understand that this is a dangerous world, that there are terrorists on our doorstep, that there are terrorists among us who want to destroy this country, who want to bring down our tallest buildings, who want to kill our children? We have to do this. We are forced to do this. We have no choice. We must be prepared for the very worst.
Yeah, well, London can't ban people born in London and thereby protect itself without, kicking everybody out of London. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And you can't bring people to an understanding and civil, nonviolent discourse by enraging them, by bombing countries. I mean, this idea that going and marketing and pushing weapons sales on the Middle East, which outside of Israel doesn't really make weapons. The United States is overwhelmingly the weapons dealer to the Middle East. And then going and bombing countries and propping up dictators and invading and occupying and enraging people, that somehow that's going to make you more safe. When other countries that don't do that don't create, there aren't anti-Canadian and anti-Mexican terrorist networks in the Middle East because you haven't done what it takes to create them, right? So the idea that it's somehow defensive and protective to go and endanger yourselves by making everyone hate you, which costs thousands of times what it would cost to go and provide, medicine and food and aid and make yourselves loved, is just such a vicious cycle. I mean, once you've been indoctrinated into the idea that, that bombing people far away will help protect you, well, then it's gonna get worse and worse.
Then you just want more bombing.
I mean, every single foreign terrorist who has attacked in the United States and made any sort of statement or attempt at justifying it whatsoever has had the same explanation: revenge for U.S. militarism. Right?
Which is their country, overseas.
Right. Which is not a justification.
And we've heard, and you've talked to them, I know, we've heard from so many generals, countless generals, who go into retirement and say, we're making this worse.
Right.
We're making this much worse than it would ever be because we continue to bomb in these countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually the minute they retire, but also some years back, a national intelligence estimate from the 17 so-called intelligence agencies, said these wars in Iraq, for example, at the time was the big one, are creating hostility, are endangering the United States, are creating blowback. I mean, it's not a secret. It's obvious, and it's well understood.
There's that other lesson from history too, David, that war is very profitable. War is very good for a certain sector of the economy, right?
That's right.
Is that part of what's at play here when these guys sit around behind closed doors in Washington and have these conversations about, hey, we need to take money away from science and put it into war?
It's the bulk of what's at play, and they're almost open about it. And you have Pentagon officials, sometimes anonymously, telling journalists, this is why we need this new Cold War with Russia. It's incredibly profitable. And this is how the weapons end up handed off to the local police departments because they want to buy more weapons.
Right.
This is how the weapons end up being used so they can buy more weapons. Right? And there's no accountability. It's a department that's never audited, and it's just more weapons, more weapons, more weapons. And it's talked about as profitable and a jobs program. When it's not a jobs program. It is not a jobs program. It produces negative jobs, right? And that sounds crazy because everybody knows somebody who works for a weapons company or a university funded by weapons companies, right? But the studies are clear. Tax cuts for working people, never mind, investing in infrastructure or education, produces more jobs than military spending. Right? So never taxing those dollars and spending them on all those weapons in the first place produces more jobs. It's a drain, as one would logically expect. It doesn't...
And we also have to admit the fact that if you pour billions of dollars more into the sector in the American economy that makes weapons, well, they're not just making weapons for the U.S. government. They're making and selling those weapons that you have invested in them. You've made it possible for them to make more.
Yeah.
They're out selling them in Africa. They're selling them to the Middle East. And they don't care where the weapons end up. They're just making money.
Yeah, there are 6 countries that sell almost all the weapons internationally, and they are the 5 permanent members and saboteurs of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. And number 1 is the United States in weapons worldwide, in weapons to poor countries, in weapons to dictatorships, and in weapons to the Middle East. Right? So if you don't arm a region and you don't prop up dictators, and if France and Britain hadn't carved the whole place up 100 years ago, this thinking that, the Middle East has a violent culture. Well, it has a culture of people who've been armed to the teeth. You know, you have U.S. weapons on both sides of most conflicts there, and whose nations have been dominated by U.S.-favored dictators, and whose governments have been overthrown by U.S. invasions. You know,
well, and there's a long history
culture
in the Middle East. There's a long, long history in the Middle East of Christians, Jews, and Muslims living side by side very peacefully for hundreds, thousands of years. I mean, that's
2003 in Baghdad right up until March.
And the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1917, when the West went in, and you talk about literally carving up the Middle East and creating these countries out of whole cloth, and intentionally putting warring groups into the same country so that they'd always be fighting each other, so that that country would forever be destabilized and wouldn't pose a risk to its neighbors. I mean, it's part of the imperialism of the West.
Then that was, you know, France and Britain with Russia's agreement, and later with the U.S. becoming the powerful force and buying in and continuing that practice of installing dictators and overthrowing disliked governments that, you know, has a pattern that's created what we've seen in Iraq and in Libya and now ongoing in Syria.
And that destabilization is now with the migrants escaping these war zones in places like Syria and flooding into Europe. Now it's destabilizing Europe as well.
Yeah, but the people in Yemen who are set to starve to death by the millions have nowhere to escape. They're locked in. The coast is blockaded, and the way out is Saudi Arabia, which is the nation bombing them together with the United States military and intentionally bombing food supplies, electricity, ports, intentionally starving, and schools and hospitals, intentionally starving millions of people to death.
And using our planes and our bombs to do it.
Yes.
From what I've read, I mean, if there's a World War III coming, the place to look is Yemen. I mean, it's just absolutely exploding. And sadly, most Americans couldn't find it on a map. They don't know what's going on there.
You can't limit it to one place. You know, Donald Trump has put armed drones on the border of North Korea and threatened to aggressively attack North Korea, a nuclear-armed government. The build-up towards hostility with Russia continues unabated, with the establishment in Washington, D.C. pushing Donald Trump, who, you know, the one good thing was he was somewhat resistant to that, pushing him in that direction. I mean, there are hot spots. Yeah, all the big wars now, apart from Mexico, are in the Middle East and Northeast Africa, but there are hot spots everywhere.
Yeah. We're talking with David Swanson. Very quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with David Swanson. He is the director of worldbeyondwar.org, and his must-read books include War is a Lie and Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency. David, you were at the Charlottesville City Council meeting recently. You wrote about this on your website. Very, very interesting. Charlottesville, of course, Charlottesville Mayor Mike Signer came out recently, made national news when he named the little city of Charlottesville the capital of the resistance, and proposed, it wasn't just grandstanding, he actually proposed a number of policy measures, local government policies, that would in action express opposition to the Trump agenda in Washington. What happened recently in Charlottesville City Council? Tell us the story.
He says he's working on immigration policy. I haven't seen any substance yet. It remains to be seen. From my point of view what he's actually going to do to match the rhetoric. But this seemed like a golden opportunity, right, to pass a resolution saying to Congress, oppose the Trump budget proposal. And instead of moving money from everything else to the military, move money from the military to everything else.
Right. And Charlottesville, just to clarify something really quick, the Charlottesville City government, in the members of City Council, the 5 members, in looking at this resolution, they were doing what local governments all over the country do as representatives of citizens. They express their sentiment in adopting a number of resolutions about what state government is doing, what the federal government is doing, whatever's going on in the world. So this isn't unique to Charlottesville to have some kind of resolution opposing the Trump budget.
No, this is a tradition through U.S. history that has helped end apartheid in South Africa, helped end various policies out of Washington, and something that is in the Jefferson Manual that Thomas Jefferson wrote for the Congress. You know, cities can represent local constituencies to higher levels of government.
The founders wanted local governments to do just this kind of thing.
Yes, and they should. And so, yes, so Council member Kristen Sakos redrafted the draft that I had produced, and her draft was a good one, and they had 3 votes for it, including Wes Bellamy and Bob Fenwick, and I was ready to see it pass, and Kristen chose to gain a 4th vote, the vote of Kathy Galvin, by putting in a nonsense line about how all the wars are fought to protect our rights. And I asked Kristen Sakos if she actually believed that, you know, because we always have fewer rights after every war, no matter how much people shout about freedom. And she said, well, I think most of the troops probably believe it. You know, well, on that basis, Charlottesville City Council ought to, you know, declare climate change to be a fraud and angels to be real, and so, you know, just announce things because people already believe them.
But it was politics. She was getting another vote on the resolution.
So she got 4 votes. There was 1 sentence nobody will notice. It's a good deal. They passed it. The 5th vote would have been the mayor, Mike Signer, Mr. Capital of the Resistance. But he didn't support this resolution. He gave a long speech in the meeting about why he was abstaining. And his reasons were not his real reasons because they made no sense.
Well, what did he say?
For one thing, he said, if we vote on a national issue that's not a local city business problem, we will be opening the door to vote on hundreds of other national issues. Sounds, you know, almost reasonable, except that within 5 minutes of the 4-0 vote, they voted 5-0 with him on another resolution on a national issue. You know,
so he did what he said he didn't want to do.
He opened that horrific door to hundreds of national resolutions.
So what's your read on why he might have abstained on a resolution opposing the Trump budget?
Well, he gave other reasons that also made not the slightest bit of sense. We can go into if there's time, but I think the real reason is to be found in the incredible financing of his campaign and in his behavior as if he would like some higher office to be purchased for him in the future in our corrupt system, in which the Democratic Party establishment in Washington, D.C., like Mike Signer, will never oppose military spending, even if it reaches 100% of the
discretionary budget.
Yeah.
So that, you think that's really what's at play here, is he didn't want on his record necessarily, and we can ask Mike, he's been on this program many times before, but you know, that he wouldn't necessarily want on his record, hey, you opposed the Trump budget proposed, you know, drastic increases in military spending, you must be opposed to the troops.
Right. I think he was
every
wary
politician
of
is
that.
Afraid of that.
Yeah. But he came up with nonsense excuses. Like I was talking about how military spending is an economic drain, negative jobs. He because he failed or chose not to understand that, he claimed that, well, military spending does produce some jobs, you know, and that was because he objecting to a footnote to a clause that wasn't even in the draft anymore, you know. So he was stretching to find something to say,
and he
didn't want to abstain because he didn't want to admit.
And moments later,
that he's simply a coward. You know, I mean, a coward when it comes to confronting his funders and his vision of who the powers that be in Washington are and what they want.
And even on the left, the powers that be endorse the war machine.
The powers in Washington, I don't know that any of them are on the left, but they certainly back military. Now, the Congressional Progressive Caucus has put out a good statement. Barbara Lee has put out a good statement. Prince George's County, Maryland passed a similar resolution the next day. New Haven, Connecticut already passed a similar resolution. But there are other cities, Pittsburgh, Ann Arbor, other cities that are passing these resolutions saying, I'm against this cut, I'm against this cut, I'm against this cut, and never mentioning the existence of the military where all the money's going.
Yeah.
Which is why, you had this poor soul come into the city council meeting the other night in Charlottesville and say, I'm for the smaller budget that Trump is proposing.
It's not a smaller
Trump
budget.
Trump isn't proposing.
Yeah. David, thank you for being there. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
for the work you do. It's worldbeyondwar.org, and you can find the complete archive of this program online. Check it out, Media and Citizenship. As we go out, I want to share with you from the archive a barefoot excursions, a little local history of this little city I love here in Charlottesville. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other. Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot here at the University of Virginia, and this is University Hall at UVA, which opened in the fall of 1965 and was the largest indoor arena in Virginia. Construction on the now historic University Hall at UVA actually began in 1961. It was built to replace Memorial Gymnasium, which had first opened in 1924, and U-Hall is an historic symbol of the University of Virginia's commitment to big-time athletics. The first event here in U-Hall was actually not a basketball game, but a performance by the Czech Philharmonic. The first basketball game was December of 1965, and UVA unfortunately lost to the Kentucky Wildcats 99-73. U-Hall has seen unforgettable moments of UVA history, including January 11th, 1971, an unforgettable night when a sophomore guard, 6'4", Barry Parkhill, made a shot in the last second in the game against number 2 South Carolina, and UVA won that game. University Hall is perhaps best known as the house that Ralph built. Harrisonburg High School student Ralph Sampson came to the University of Virginia in the fall of 1979. He was 7'4", and he joined the University of Virginia Cavaliers, playing here in U-Hall for 4 years while he was a student. And during that 4 years, the Cavaliers went 49-2. Now, despite the fact that U-Hall was the biggest indoor arena in Virginia when it opened in 1965, it only had about 9,000 seats. So UVA outgrew U-Hall by the 1980s, certainly the 90s, and it was replaced in the summer of 2006 by the John Paul Jones Arena.